So, what if one of the most famous, most celebrated ideas in all of modern logic wasn't just wrong, but was actually a giant contradiction from the start? Today, we're diving into a really fascinating and radical critique of Kurt Gödel's legendary incompleteness theorems. And right out of the gate, the source material for this whole analysis pulls no punches. It calls Gödel's work a grand contradiction posing as a theorem. I mean, that's not just a polite disagreement, right? That is a direct challenge to what many consider a cornerstone of 20th century thought. Okay, so before we can really get into the critique, we have to do a quick refresh on what we're actually talking about. What are Gödel's theorems, and why did they make such a huge splash in the first place? All right, here are the two big ones. Just think of a formal system as any set of rules, like the rules for chess or basic math. Gödel's first theorem basically says that in any system like that, you can always create statements that are true, but you can't actually prove they're true using the system's own rulebook. They're just stuck in limbo. And the second theorem, which is the real bombshell, logically follows from that. It says that no system can ever prove that its own rules are totally consistent and free of contradictions. And you can see why this was such a huge deal. For decades, it's been seen as this profound, humbling statement about the fundamental limits of what we can know. It kind of suggested that some truths might just be forever out of our reach, which was a pretty big pill to swallow for mathematicians and philosophers.
But what if that whole interpretation is just flat out wrong? Now we get to the core of this analysis. A radical critique that asks if Gödel's work was really profound or maybe just a fashionable but deeply flawed piece of logic.
Now just listen to the tone here. It is so dismissive. The source isn't just arguing against Gödel, it's saying his work isn't even worth a deep dive. And why? Because it claims the type of paradox he built his whole argument on had already been debunked by other thinkers. This really gets to the heart of the critique. It puts Gödel's work, which it compares to a clever but logically impossible M.C. Escher drawing, right next to the philosophy of Karl Popper. Popper's whole thing was falsifiability. The idea that you don't really prove things true, you just try your best to prove them false. And what survives is your best current theory. The source claims this approach is just way more useful and avoids the kind of logical quicksand Gödel got stuck in. So let's just lay out the main points of attack. First, the critique says Theorem 1 is, technically true, but it's trivial. It's just a clever parlor trick. Then it says, well, Theorem 2 is actually correct, but Gödel's proof connecting it to Theorem 1 is shaky. But here's the real kicker. The source claims that all these mind-bending paradoxes could have been avoided just by adding one simple rule. The final verdict? It was all a tempest in a teapot, like a fancy chess tournament that had nothing to do with solving real-world problems. Okay, so if Gödel's whole system is a house of cards, what's the alternative? Well, the source argues we need to get back to something much more basic, something that's impossible to doubt, the tautology. A tautology is just a statement that's true because it is. Its truth is baked right into its own definition. The simplest, purest form of this is A equals A. It doesn't need any proof from the outside because it proves itself. I know this might sound a little abstract, so let's use the source's favorite example. Imagine this. Step 1, I point at an object. Step 2, I create a definition for it, and I call it a dog. Step 3, I create another definition, and I say its color is white. The conclusion, that is a white dog, is now a 100% proven statement. But how? And the answer is almost ridiculously simple. You're just calling a white dog a white dog. See, because you first defined it as a dog, and then you defined its color as white, the final statement has to be true. It's just a real-world version of A equals A. Within the little logical system you just built, how could you possibly be wrong? Now, the source argues that this is not just some silly word game. This is it. This is the fundamental way we build all knowledge. We learn what a dog is, or white, or gravity, or anything else, by creating and agreeing upon a huge shared library of definitions. So why is this so important? Well, because this idea of truth by definition becomes the bedrock for everything else. It's how language works. And critically, it's completely immune to those tricky "this statement is false" liar's paradoxes that Gödel loved, because a definition can't really refer to itself in that twisted way. The big claim here is that All logical arguments are just really, really fancy versions of A equals A, building up a huge, stable body of knowledge we can actually trust.
So, where does this all leave us? If truth is really built on definitions, then it kind of forces us to completely rethink what we're even doing when we say we prove something or that we know something. We're basically looking at three competing philosophies of knowledge. You've got the Russell and Gödel approach, which is trying to build this perfect, self-contained system of formal proofs. Then you've got Popper's way, try to break everything and see what's left standing. And then you have this third view from our source that says real, solid knowledge comes from us agreeing on definitions, from agreeing that A is in fact A. And when you look at it through that lens, some of the most famous projects in the history of logic start to look, well, a little bit silly. Bertrand Russell spending hundreds of pages to formally prove that 1 + 1 = 2. The source argues this was just a massive waste of intellectual energy, fiddling while Rome burns, while more important problems were waiting to be solved.
I mean, just think about that. Over a century of debate, involving some of the smartest people who ever lived, all wrestling with paradoxes that this critique says shouldn't have been a problem in the first place. It claims that entire 100-year detour could have been avoided with one simple rule from the beginning. A statement can't be about itself. Period.
And that leaves us with a pretty profound and maybe even a little unsettling final question. If so much of what we call truth and knowledge is really just this giant, intricate web of things we've agreed to call true, just very complex ways of saying A equals A, then what are we actually discovering? Are we uncovering the secrets of the universe? Or are we just getting better and better at reading a map that we drew ourselves?